The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 52nd floor, like it had grievances to settle. Each drop traced silver paths down the glass, distorting the city lights below into watercolor smears of gold and red. Elena Sterling sat motionless at her mahogany desk, her fingers steepled beneath her chin, watching the storm tear through Manhattan with the same indifference she brought to quarterly earnings reports. The office around her breathed luxury, Italian marble floors that caught the light just so, leather-bound books she'd never read arranged with mathematical precision, and 2 chairs facing her desk. One for her, one for visitors, always 2, never more. Her assistant Rachel had left hours ago with a gentle reminder about dinner. The cleaning crew had finished their silent sweep through the Sterling Technologies building. Even Marco, her PR director and the closest thing she had to a friend, had finally gone home to his wife and daughters. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But Elena remained, reviewing investor projections by the glow of her desk lamp, the numbers blurring slightly around the edges from too many hours of focus. The intercom crackled to life, startling her from her calculations. "Ms. Sterling?" The voice belonged to James, the night security guard. "I'm sorry to bother you, ma'am, but we've got a situation on 47. There's a child wandering the halls." Elena frowned, her pen pausing mid-calculation. "A child?" "Yes, ma'am. Little boy, maybe 5 or 6, soaking wet, no shoes. He won't say much, just keeps asking about the lady with the light." She glanced at her desk lamp, the only beacon visible from the street in the otherwise darkened building. "Have you called the authorities?" "Was about to, ma'am, but—" James hesitated. "He's not causing trouble, just seems lost, real quiet-like." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever life presented her with variables she couldn't control. Children were chaos incarnate, unpredictable, emotional, needy, everything her ordered world was designed to exclude. "Escort him to the lobby," she said finally. "I'll handle it from there." But even as she spoke, the soft sound of bare feet on marble made her look up. A small figure stood in her doorway, water dripping from his dark hair onto her pristine floor. He couldn't have been older than 6, wearing a gray sweater 3 sizes too big and jeans with holes in the knees. His feet were bare, pale against the dark marble, and his eyes, deep brown, too old for his face, fixed on the empty chair across from her desk. James appeared behind him, slightly out of breath. "I'm sorry, Miss Sterling. He slipped past me when the elevator opened." Elena raised a hand, her gaze never leaving the boy. He stood perfectly still, not fidgeting or crying as she would have expected, just watching her with those ancient eyes, as if he were memorizing her face for later. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. "Luke," he whispered. Then, after a pause, "Luke Bennett." "Where are your parents, Luke?" The boy's shoulders dropped almost imperceptibly. "I don't have Mama. And Daddy," he swallowed hard. "Daddy went to be with the stars 2 weeks ago." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She knew that particular combination of matter-of-fact delivery and barely contained grief. She'd perfected it herself at age 7, standing in a social worker's office, explaining why her mother hadn't come back. "Can I stay with you tonight?" Luke asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have anywhere else. And the shelter is loud, and you have that extra chair." Elena stared at him, her carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. This wasn't supposed to happen. Children didn't just appear in her office at midnight, dripping rainwater, and asking impossible questions. She had protocols, procedures, a life built on the foundation that she needed no one, and no one needed her. But something in the boy's stillness called to the ghost of her own childhood, the little girl who'd learned to make herself small and quiet, hoping someone might have room for her, just for one night. "James," she said without looking away from Luke, "you can go, I'll handle this." The security guard hesitated. "Ma'am, are you sure?" "I'm sure." After James left, Elena stood slowly, her heels clicking against the marble as she walked around the desk. Up close, she could see that Luke was shivering, though whether from cold or fear she couldn't tell. "Are you hungry?" she asked. He nodded. Elena had never fed a child, had barely fed herself anything that didn't come from the executive dining room or her assistant's careful meal planning. But she had crackers in her desk drawer, left over from a board meeting, and a bottle of water that would have to do. She watched as Luke ate with careful, precise bites, holding the crackers with both hands like they were precious. He thanked her after each one, his voice so quiet she had to lean forward to hear him. "The extra chair?" she said finally. "Why did you mention that?" Luke looked at the empty chair, then back at her. "Daddy used to say that good people always keep an extra chair at their table, for someone who might need it." He paused. "You look like a good person." Elena felt something crack inside her chest, a hairline fracture in the armor she'd spent decades building. She thought of her apartment 20 floors up, sterile, perfect, untouched by anything resembling warmth or need. She thought of the spare bedroom that had never held a guest, the kitchen that had never known the sound of laughter. She thought of all the empty chairs in her life. "Just for tonight," she heard herself saying, "just until we can figure out what to do." Luke nodded solemnly, as if he'd expected nothing more, as if one night was already more than he'd dared to hope for. As Elena gathered her things and prepared to take this strange, quiet boy home, she caught sight of their reflection in the dark window. A woman and child standing side by side, both of them lost in their own way, both of them trying to figure out what came next. The rain continued to fall, washing the city clean, and somewhere in the space between one heartbeat and the next, Elena Sterling's perfectly ordered world began to change. Elena Sterling had faced down hostile takeovers, weathered market crashes, and stared down boardrooms full of men who thought her gender was a liability. But she had never faced anything quite like Luke Bennett eating cereal at her kitchen island at 7 in the morning, his legs swinging from the too-high stool, humming softly to himself. Her apartment, usually tomb-quiet except for the distant hum of traffic, felt different with another person in it. Not loud, exactly. Luke was remarkably quiet for a child, but alive in a way that made Elena hyper-aware of every sound. The clink of his spoon against the bowl, the soft whisper of his bare feet on the hardwood, the way he said thank you after every small kindness, as if gratitude were a prayer he'd learned by heart. She'd given him one of her old Columbia t-shirts to sleep in, and it hung on him like a dress, the sleeves rolled up 3 times. This morning, she'd watched from the kitchen doorway as he made his bed with military precision, smoothing every wrinkle, tucking the corners just so. When he'd noticed her watching, he'd smiled shyly and said, "Daddy taught me. He said making your bed makes the whole day better." Now, as Elena sipped her coffee and watched Luke carefully spoon up the last of his cereal, her phone buzzed with a text from Rachel's CPS called, "Agent Hart will be there at 10. I told her you're working from home today. Also picked up some clothes, size 5/6 based on my nephew. They're with security." Elena's stomach clenched. She'd called Child Protective Services herself the night before, following protocol even as every instinct screamed against it. She told herself it was the right thing to do, the responsible thing. Luke needed proper placement, professional care, people who knew how to raise children. People who weren't her. "Luke," she said carefully, setting down her coffee cup, "we're going to have a visitor today, a woman from Child Services. She's going to ask you some questions." Luke's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. "Are you sending me away?" The question was asked without accusation, just quiet resignation that broke Elena's heart in ways she didn't know were possible. "I'm not sending you anywhere," she said, surprised by the fierceness in her own voice. "But there are rules about children staying with people they don't know very well." "I know you," Luke said simply. "You have the extra chair, you make good cereal, and you don't yell when I hum." Before Elena could respond, the doorman's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ms. Sterling, Agent Hart from Child Protective Services is here to see you." Elena smoothed her blazer, checked her reflection in the hallway mirror, and tried to summon the composure that had carried her through 1,000 business meetings. But when she opened the door to find Agent Lila Hart, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense clipboard, she felt as exposed as she had that first day pitching investors from a borrowed conference room. "Miss Sterling, I'm Agent Hart. Thank you for calling this in." The woman's voice was professionally neutral, but her eyes were already taking inventory of the apartment. The expensive furniture, the lack of childproofing, the general atmosphere of a space designed for one very organized adult. "Of course," Elena said, stepping aside to let her in. "Luke is in the kitchen." Agent Hart's expression softened the moment she saw Luke, who had finished his cereal, and was now sitting perfectly still, hands folded in his lap, watching the interaction with those two old eyes. "Hello, Luke," Agent Hart said, pulling out a chair and sitting at his eye level. "I'm Lila. I heard you had an adventure yesterday." Luke nodded gravely. "I got lost in the storm, but Ms. Elena has the extra chair." "The extra chair?" "For people who need it," Luke explained, as if this were obvious. "Daddy always said good people keep an extra chair." Elena watched Agent Hart's professional mask slip slightly, a flicker of genuine warmth crossing her features. The woman pulled out a small notebook and began asking gentle questions. Luke's full name, his father's name, when he'd last eaten a full meal before yesterday. Luke answered each one with careful honesty, occasionally glancing at Elena as if checking to make sure she was still there. "Luke, can you tell me about this?" Agent Hart held up a small, red marble she'd pulled from his pocket. Luke's face lit up. "That's from Daddy. He said it was magic, that whenever I held it and made a wish, he'd hear it even if he was far away." His smile faltered slightly. "I've been wishing a lot lately, but I think the stars are too far for wishes to reach." Agent Hart's pen stilled on her notepad. Elena felt her own throat tighten at the simple honesty of it, the way Luke carried his grief like a small, careful burden. After Luke went to change into the clothes Rachel had sent up, jeans that actually fit and a soft blue sweater, Agent Hart turned to Elena with an expression that was harder to read. "Miss Sterling, I have to ask, this is a significant deviation from your normal life. What prompted you to take in a child you'd never met?" Elena had prepared for this question, had a dozen reasonable answers about civic duty and temporary circumstances. But looking at Agent Hart's direct gaze, she found herself saying something else entirely. "He asked if he could stay, and I remembered what it was like to ask that question and have no one say yes." Agent Hart's eyebrows rose slightly. "You were in foster care." 7 years, Elena said. 5 different homes. I know what it looks like when a child stops asking for things because they're tired of being disappointed." "And you think Luke is at that point?" Elena considered this, thinking of the way Luke thanked her for everything, asked for nothing, made himself as small and unobtrusive as possible. "I think Luke is trying very hard not to be a burden." Which means he's already learned the wrong lesson about his own worth. When Luke returned, Agent Hart spent another hour observing him, watching how he interacted with Elena, how comfortable he seemed in the space, whether he showed signs of distress or fear. Elena found herself holding her breath through all of it, waiting for the inevitable moment when Agent Hart would explain why this arrangement couldn't continue. Instead, Agent Hart closed her notebook and looked between Elena and Luke thoughtfully. "I'm going to recommend a temporary placement evaluation," she said finally. "Luke seems comfortable here, and Miss Sterling, while your living situation isn't traditional, you've clearly created a safe environment. I'll need to file a report and schedule a follow-up visit, but Luke can remain here while we sort out next steps." Elena felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched tight. "However," Agent Hart continued, "I should mention that there's been some interest in this case. Apparently, someone contacted the local news about a prominent CEO taking in a child. Nothing's been published yet, but—" Elena's blood went cold. She thought immediately of Harold Grayston, the chairman of her board, whose smile never quite reached his eyes, and who'd been looking for reasons to question her leadership for months. As if summoned by her thoughts, her phone buzzed with a text from Marco Gray, called an emergency board check-in for this afternoon. "Says there are reputation concerns that need immediate discussion. Want me to handle it?" Elena looked at Luke, who was showing Agent Hart his drawings, careful sketches of buildings and trees, and what looked like 2 figures holding hands under a starry sky. He glanced up and smiled at her, the kind of uncomplicated happiness she'd forgotten existed. She typed back, "No, I'll handle it myself." As Agent Hart prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Ms. Sterling, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I've seen a lot of temporary placements that were just transactions. This doesn't feel like that." "What does it feel like?" Elena asked. Agent Hart glanced back at Luke, who was carefully putting his drawings away in a manila folder Elena had given him. Like maybe the person who needed rescuing wasn't just the child. After Agent Hart left, Elena sat at her kitchen island watching Luke work on a new drawing. The apartment felt different somehow, not just because there was another person in it, but because there was another person in it who belonged there, at least for now. Her phone buzzed again. Gray, the board, the reputation concerns that could unravel everything she'd built. But looking at Luke, bent over his paper with serious concentration, Elena realized that for the first time in her adult life, there was something she cared about more than protecting her empire. She just wasn't sure yet what she was willing to risk to keep it. Elena had been in the middle of reviewing quarterly projections when she noticed Luke hadn't made a sound in over an hour. In the 3 days he'd been staying with her, she'd grown accustomed to the quiet soundtrack of his presence, the soft whisper of crayon on paper, the gentle humming of songs his father had taught him, the occasional question asked in that careful, hopeful voice that never presumed too much. But this silence felt different, heavier. She found him in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the Persian rug with his backpack open beside him. In his hands was a photograph that had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases had worn soft as fabric. His shoulders were hunched forward, and even from across the room Elena could see the way his small fingers trembled against the paper. "Luke?" He looked up quickly, swiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cry on your rug." The casual way he apologized for his grief, as if tears were something to be ashamed of, cleaned up, hidden away, sent a sharp pain through Elena's chest. She sat down beside him, her expensive skirt fanning out across the floor, and waited. After a moment, Luke held out the photograph. "This is my daddy." Elena took it carefully, treating it with the reverence she could see it deserved. The image was slightly blurred, taken by someone with unsteady hands, but she could make out 2 figures. A tall man with Luke's dark hair and gentle eyes, and a little boy perched on his shoulders, both of them grinning at the camera. In the background she could see what looked like a small apartment, warm and cluttered in all the ways hers wasn't. "He looks like a good daddy," she said softly. "He was the best daddy." Luke's voice was thick with unshed tears. "He made pancakes shaped like stars, and he knew all the words to every song on the radio, and when I had nightmares, he'd tell me stories about brave little boys who lived in castles made of clouds." Elena's throat tightened. She thought of her own childhood nightmares, the ones that had sent her padding down cold hallway after cold hallway, looking for someone who might comfort her, finding only closed doors and exhausted foster parents who'd signed up for housing, not parenting. "What happened to him, Luke?" Luke leaned against her side so naturally that Elena barely remembered to tense. "A car hit him when he was walking home from work. The police said it was dark, and the person didn't see him." He paused. "But I think they just didn't want to look hard enough." The matter-of-fact way he said it broke something in Elena's careful composure. This child had already learned too much about how the world worked, about how some lives were valued less than others, about how sometimes accident was just another word for no one cared enough to be more careful. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it more than she'd meant anything in years. "That should never have happened to him, or to you." Luke nodded gravely, then reached into his backpack again. This time, he pulled out a small notebook, its pages filled with crayon drawings. He flipped through them slowly, and Elena saw images of a man and boy together, reading books, flying kites, sitting at a small kitchen table with what looked like star-shaped pancakes. "I draw them so I don't forget," Luke explained. "Daddy said memories are like seeds. You have to plant them and water them, or they don't grow right." On the last page was something different, a more recent drawing that made Elena's breath catch. It showed 3 figures. A tall man reaching down from a sky full of stars, a little boy standing on the ground, and between them, a woman in what looked like a business suit, her hand extended toward the child. "That's you," Luke said, suddenly shy. "And me, and Daddy watching from the stars to make sure you're okay too." Elena stared at the drawing, at the careful way Luke had colored in her hair, the precise angle of her outstretched hand. She realized that while she'd been wrestling with whether she could take care of him, he'd been worried about taking care of her. "Luke," she said carefully, "do you think your daddy would be okay with you staying here, with me?" Luke considered this with the same serious attention he brought to everything else. Daddy always said that families aren't just the people you're born with. Sometimes, they're the people who choose to love you when they don't have to. He looked at her with those ancient eyes. "Do you choose to love me, Ms. Elena?" The question hung in the air between them, simple and enormous. Elena thought of all the reasons she should say no. The board meeting this afternoon, Gray's thinly veiled threats, the media attention that could destroy everything she'd built. She thought of her carefully constructed life, her need for control, her complete lack of experience with children. Then she looked at Luke Strong again, at the way he'd sketched her reaching out, not pulling away. "Yes," she said quietly, "I do choose that." Luke smiled, the first truly unreserved smile she'd seen from him, and leaned more fully against her side. Elena, who hadn't hugged another person in longer than she could remember, found her arm coming around his small shoulders, holding him close. They sat like that for a long time, surrounded by the evidence of love lost and love found, both of them learning how to be brave enough for whatever came next. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marco. Board meeting moved to 4 p.m. Gray's bringing lawyers. Whatever you're planning to do, Elena, do it with backup. Elena looked down at Luke, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder, the photo of his father still clutched in his small fist. She thought about the extra chair in her office, the one that had been empty for so long she'd stopped noticing it. Maybe it was time to fill it. She reached for her phone and typed, "I'll be there. And Marco, I'm bringing Luke with me." The response came quickly, "Are you sure?" Elena looked at the drawing again, at the woman reaching out instead of pulling back, at the little boy who'd seen something in her worth saving. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Outside, the afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds that had lingered since the storm 3 days ago. In Elena's living room, a photograph of a father's love lay next to a drawing of hope for the future, and for the first time in years, Elena Sterling wasn't afraid of either one. The Sterling Technologies boardroom had been designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of Manhattan, while the massive ebony table could seat 20 executives in leather chairs that cost more than most people's cars. Elena had chosen every detail herself. The stark white walls, the minimalist lighting, the way the space seemed to swallow sound and soften voices, making everyone lean forward to be heard. She'd never brought a child into this room before. Luke sat in the corner near the windows. A small folding chair Rachel had somehow procured, positioned at a child-sized table with paper and crayons. He wore the blue sweater Rachel had picked out, his hair neatly combed, his small hands moving carefully across the paper as he drew. He looked impossibly small against the backdrop of corporate power, and Elena felt a fierce protectiveness rise in her chest. "Elena." Harold Grayston's voice cut through the murmur of conversation as board members filed in. "I wasn't aware this was Bring Your Child to Work Day." Gray was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He'd been instrumental in Elena's early funding rounds, back when she'd needed his connections more than she'd needed to trust him. Now, watching him look at Luke like he was an unfortunate stain on the conference table, Elena wondered how she'd ever convinced herself he was an ally. "Luke is staying with me temporarily," Elena said evenly, taking her seat at the head of the table. "I thought it was important for the board to understand the full scope of recent events." "Recent events?" Board member Patricia Chen looked between Elena and Luke with obvious confusion. "Elena, what's going on?" Elena had prepared for this moment, had rehearsed her words until they felt like armor, but sitting there with Luke's quiet presence in the corner, she found herself abandoning her careful script. 4 days ago, during the storm, Luke found his way to my office. He's 6 years old, and he'd just lost his father in a hit-and-run accident. She paused, letting that sink in. He asked if he could stay with me for one night. That night has become several, and if I have my way, it will become permanent. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena watched the faces around the table. Surprise, concern, and in Gray's case, barely concealed satisfaction. "Elena," Gray's voice was carefully modulated, reasonable. "I think we all admire your charitable impulse. But surely you can see how this reflects on the company." Sterling. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Technologies has built its reputation on innovation and reliability. How do our shareholders react when they learn our CEO is playing house with a random child? "His name is Luke," Elena said sharply, "and he's not random. He's a little boy who needed help." Of course. Gray waved a dismissive hand. "But there are proper channels for these things. foster care agencies, adoption services, people trained to handle situations like this. Elena felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. Situations like what exactly? Children in crisis, Gray said smoothly. Tragedy cases. Issues that require professional intervention, not corporate executives with no relevant experience. From the corner came a small voice. Excuse me? Every head in the room turned toward Luke, who had stood up from his little table and was looking directly at Gray with those two old eyes. I don't mean to interrupt, Luke said politely, but I heard you talking about me, and Daddy always said it's not polite to talk about people when they're right there. Gray's carefully constructed expression faltered slightly. Of course, son. We're just… I'm not your son, Luke said matter-of-factly. My daddy died, and his name was Nathan Bennett, and he was the best daddy in the whole world. He taught me how to tie my shoes and make pancakes and say please and thank you, and he always said that good people build chairs for others to sit in. Luke walked over to Elena's chair and stood beside it, his small hand resting on the armrest. Ms. Elena built me a chair when I didn't have anywhere to sit. She didn't have to, but she did it anyway. Daddy would have liked her. The room was completely silent. Elena looked down at Luke, at the way he stood straight and tall despite being the smallest person in the room, and felt something shift in her chest. A settling, like puzzle pieces finally clicking into place. Thank you, Luke, she said softly. Then, to the room, Luke raises an important point about chairs, about making space for people who need it. She stood, Luke moving slightly closer to her side. Sterling Technologies has always prided itself on innovation, on seeing opportunities where others see obstacles, on building solutions instead of walking away from problems. Elena gestured toward the windows, toward the city sprawling below them. Out there are thousands of children in foster care, aging out of the system with no support, no connections, no chance to develop the skills they need to succeed. What if instead of seeing that as someone else's problem, we saw it as an opportunity? Board member James Morrison leaned forward. What are you proposing? A pipeline program. Foster care to internship to career development. We partner with local agencies, provide mentorship, job training, educational scholarships. We don't just write checks. We build chairs at our table for young people who have never been invited to sit down. Elena could see the idea taking root around the table. Morrison was nodding slowly. Chen was taking notes. Even Gray couldn't entirely hide his interest, though his expression remained skeptical. And you think your personal situation qualifies you to lead such an initiative? Gray asked. Elena looked down at Luke, who was watching her with complete trust, and thought about all the closed doors of her childhood, all the times she'd been told she was too much trouble, not worth the effort. I think my personal experience, both as someone who aged out of foster care and as someone who has learned what it means to make room for another person, gives me exactly the perspective this initiative needs. Marco, who had been quietly taking notes in the back of the room, stood up. I've prepared some preliminary research on public perception of corporate social responsibility initiatives. 93% of consumers are more likely to support companies that demonstrate authentic commitment to social causes. This could be exactly the kind of leadership position that sets Sterling apart. Gray's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. And if the media decides to focus on the irregularity of the situation rather than the nobility of the cause? Then we tell the truth, Elena said simply. We tell them that sometimes the most important business decisions aren't made in boardrooms. They're made when a child asks for help and someone decides to say yes. Luke tugged gently on Elena's sleeve. When she looked down, he held up a crayon drawing, a large table surrounded by chairs, each one occupied by a stick figure with a different colored shirt. At the head of the table sat a figure with long dark hair and a blue dress. I drew your meeting, he whispered. Everyone has a chair. Elena took the drawing, her throat tightening as she looked at it. Around the table, she could see board members craning their necks to get a glimpse of Luke's artwork. Luke, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, would you like to tell everyone what this drawing shows? Luke nodded solemnly. It's a table where everyone belongs. Daddy always said that's what good tables look like. Big enough for everyone who needs a place to sit. Patricia Chen was the first to speak. I move to approve Elena's proposal for the Sterling Futures Initiative. We can work out the details, but the concept has merit. Seconded, Morrison said quickly. Gray looked around the table, clearly calculating votes and finding himself outnumbered. Very well, we'll table this for further discussion. But Elena, I hope you understand that your personal choices will continue to be scrutinized. The board has a responsibility to our shareholders. I understand perfectly, Elena said, her hand finding Luke's shoulder, and I'm prepared for that scrutiny. As the meeting broke up and board members filed out, many stopping to say hello to Luke or compliment his drawing, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of fighting for something that mattered more than profit margins. Gray was the last to leave. At the door, he paused and looked back at Elena and Luke. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Whatever you think you're building here, it won't last. Children are a liability in this business, Elena. Eventually, you'll have to choose." After he left, Elena knelt down to Luke's eye level. "Are you okay? That was a lot of grown-up talk." Luke nodded, then carefully folded his drawing and handed it to her. "Can you keep this? For when you need to remember what your table looks like when everyone has a chair." Elena took the drawing, looking at the careful way Luke had drawn each figure, the attention he'd paid to making sure every chair was occupied. "I'll keep it right here," she said, tucking it into her portfolio. "Thank you for reminding me what we're really building." As they walked toward the elevator, Luke slipped his small hand into hers. "Miss Elena, are you my family now?" The question was asked so simply, with such hope, that Elena felt her careful composure finally crack completely. "Yes," she whispered, "if you want me to be." "I do," Luke said, squeezing her hand. "I really, really do." The elevator doors closed around them, carrying them toward whatever came next, together. The late afternoon sun streamed through the lobby windows of Elena's building, casting long golden rectangles across the marble floor. Luke had been living with her for 6 days now, and Elena was discovering that the simple act of coming home felt entirely different when there was someone waiting for her arrival. "Miss Elena!" Luke's voice echoed across the vast lobby as she emerged from the elevator, his small figure racing toward her with the kind of unguarded joy she'd forgotten existed. He'd been downstairs with Rachel, who often picked him up from the building's small library, where he spent his afternoons drawing and reading while Elena finished her work. "Slow down, sweetheart," Rachel called, but she was smiling as she watched Luke launch himself at Elena's legs, wrapping his arms around her knees in a hug that never failed to surprise her with its warmth. "I made you a picture of the Hudson River," Luke announced, pulling back to look up at her with bright eyes. "Mr. James showed me how to see it from the windows on the 20th floor, and I drew all the boats." Elena felt the familiar tightness in her chest ease as she looked down at him. "I can't wait to see it. But first, we should probably head upstairs and—" "Oh, Otter." Luke's exclamation made her pause. He was looking past her toward the corner of the lobby, where a large, shaggy dog sat with the patient resignation of an animal who'd learned to wait. The dog was clearly elderly, his golden fur faded to cream around the muzzle, one ear missing its tip. He wore a faded red collar but no leash, and he was watching the stream of residents and visitors with the weary interest of someone who'd seen it all before. "That's Baxter," James, the security guard, said as he approached them. "Belongs to our old doorman, Mr. Peterson. Well, belonged. Peterson passed last month, and Baxter's been hanging around ever since. Building management keeps saying they'll call animal control, but—" he shrugged helplessly. "Old dog doesn't cause trouble. Just sits there like he's waiting for someone." Luke had already started walking toward Baxter, moving with the careful slowness he brought to all new encounters. "Hi, Baxter," he said softly, stopping just out of reach and crouching down. "Are you lonely too?" The dog lifted his head, studying Luke with dark eyes that held their own kind of ancient wisdom. After a moment, Baxter's tail gave a tentative wag. "Can I pet him?" Luke asked, looking back at Elena. Elena found herself nodding, though she'd never been particularly fond of animals. Too much mess, too much unpredictability. But watching Luke extend his small hand toward Baxter, waiting patiently for the dog to sniff his fingers before gently stroking the soft fur behind his ears, she felt something shift in her chest. "He likes you," Rachel observed, watching as Baxter leaned into Luke's touch with a soft sigh. "That dog hasn't let anyone near him since Mr. Peterson died." "I think he misses his person," Luke said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood loss intimately. "Don't you, Baxter? It's hard when people go away and don't come back." Baxter's response was to rest his large head against Luke's small shoulder, a gesture so gentle and trusting that Elena felt her throat tighten. "Miss Elena?" Luke looked up at her with hopeful eyes. "Could Baxter come upstairs with us, just to visit? I think he might be hungry." Every practical bone in Elena's body wanted to say no. She'd just gotten used to sharing her space with Luke. Adding a large, elderly dog seemed like chaos waiting to happen. Her apartment was all white furniture and expensive rugs. No place for muddy paws and shedding fur. But looking at Luke's face, at the way he'd unconsciously positioned himself between Baxter and the world, as if already protecting this new friend, Elena found herself reconsidering. "Just to visit," she heard herself saying. "We'll see how it goes." Luke's smile could have powered the building's lights. "Did you hear that, Baxter? You get to come see where I live now." The elevator ride up was an exercise in cramped logistics. Elena pressed against one wall, Rachel against another, Luke sitting cross-legged on the floor with his arms around Baxter's neck. The dog seemed surprisingly calm about the whole experience, as if he'd been riding elevators his entire life. Elena's apartment, which had felt so much more alive with Luke in it, transformed again with Baxter's presence. The dog moved through the space with careful dignity, sniffing corners and taking inventory with the thoroughness of a security professional. He paused at the kitchen, where Luke's cereal bowl from that morning still sat in the sink, and his tail wagged once in apparent approval. "I think he likes it," Luke announced. "Look, he's smiling." Elena wouldn't have called Baxter's expression a smile, exactly, but there was something peaceful about the way the dog settled onto the rug in front of the fireplace, as if he'd found something he'd been looking for. "We should probably get him some water," Elena said, surprised by her own practicality, "and maybe something to eat." Rachel volunteered to run to the pet store on the corner, while Elena called the building manager to let him know Baxter was with them temporarily. Luke, meanwhile, had appointed himself Baxter's official host, showing him the apartment room by room and explaining the function of various furniture pieces. "This is Ms. Elena's reading chair," she heard him saying from the living room. "She doesn't read much, but she sits here when she's thinking hard thoughts. And this is the kitchen, where we make cereal and sandwiches and sometimes pancakes if you ask really nicely." By the time Rachel returned with dog food, a water bowl, and what appeared to be half the pet store's inventory of treats and toys, Baxter had claimed his spot on the rug with the authority of someone who'd finally found home. "I may have gotten a little carried away," Rachel admitted, setting down multiple bags. "But look, they have these puzzle toys that are supposed to be good for older dogs, minds, and this orthopedic bed, and—" "Rachel," Elena interrupted gently. "It's perfect. Thank you." That evening, Elena found herself doing something she'd never imagined. Sitting on her living room floor with a 6-year-old boy and an elderly dog, watching Luke carefully measure out Baxter's dinner while explaining the importance of not eating too fast. "Daddy always said rushing makes your tummy hurt," Luke told Baxter seriously, "and you've got to save room for dessert treats, but only if you eat all your regular food first." Baxter, for his part, seemed to understand the rules perfectly, eating his kibble with deliberate slowness while Luke sat beside him, occasionally reaching out to stroke his fur. As bedtime approached, Elena assumed Baxter would sleep in the living room on the expensive dog bed Rachel had purchased. Instead, she found Luke in his pajamas, gently coaxing the old dog toward his bedroom. "Luke," she started, then stopped. Because Baxter was moving slowly but purposefully toward Luke's room, and when Luke climbed into bed, the dog settled on the rug beside him with a contented sigh that seemed to echo through the apartment. "Is this okay?" Luke asked, his voice already drowsy. "Baxter doesn't like to be alone, and I don't like to be alone either, so we can keep each other company." Elena stood in the doorway, watching boy and dog settle into sleep with the easy trust of souls who'd recognize something in each other. Her pristine apartment now contained a child's drawings on the refrigerator, a dog bed in the living room, and the kind of gentle chaos she'd spent her entire adult life avoiding. It should have felt overwhelming. Instead, it felt like coming alive. "It's perfectly okay," she whispered, but Luke was already asleep, one small hand resting on Baxter's fur, both of them breathing with the rhythm of the deeply content. Elena turned off the light and headed toward her own room, but paused at her bedroom window. Far below, the city glittered with a million lights, each one representing someone's home, someone's life, someone's version of family. For the first time in years, Elena Sterling wasn't watching the city from the outside. She was part of it now, part of the warm glow that meant people were home, safe, together. In the morning, she knew there would be calls from Agent Hart, pressure from the board, decisions about guardianship papers and permanent arrangements. But tonight, there was just this, a child and a dog sleeping peacefully in the next room, trusting her to keep them safe. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Elena woke at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of soft crying. In the 6 days Luke had been staying with her, he'd slept through the night without incident. No tears, no nightmares, no calls for comfort. She'd begun to think he was one of those children who processed grief internally, quietly, the way she had learned to do as a child when crying brought unwanted attention from overwhelmed foster parents. But tonight was different. Elena slipped out of bed and padded barefoot down the hallway, following the muffled sounds to Luke's room. The door was slightly ajar, and she could see him in the dim light filtering through the windows. Sitting up in bed with his knees drawn to his chest, tears streaming silently down his face while Baxter pressed close against his side, the dog's large head resting protectively across Luke's lap. "Hey," Elena whispered, stepping into the room. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Luke looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes, his voice thick with tears. "I dreamed Daddy came back, but when I woke up he was still gone, and I forgot for a minute where I was, and I thought maybe I was back at the shelter and—" The words tumbled out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them back for days. Elena's heart clenched. She sat on the edge of the bed, uncertain as always about physical comfort, but knowing instinctively that Luke needed more than words right now. "You're not at the shelter," she said gently. "You're here with me and Baxter. You're safe. But what if you change your mind?" Luke's voice was so small it was barely audible. "What if you decide I'm too much trouble, or too sad, or I ask for too many things?" Elena felt something crack open in her chest, not breaking, but opening, like a door she'd kept locked for decades finally admitting light. She thought of all the time she'd been told she was too much, too difficult, too damaged for permanent placement. "Luke," she said carefully, "can I tell you something? When I was little, about your age, I lived with a lot of different families, foster families. And I used to worry about the same thing, that if I was too sad about missing my mother, or if I asked for too many bedtime stories, or if I cried too much, they would send me away." Luke's tears had slowed, and he was watching her with those two old eyes. Baxter, seeming to sense the importance of the conversation, had positioned himself so that he was touching both of them. "What happened?" Luke whispered. "Some of them did send me away," Elena said honestly, "not because I was bad, but because they weren't ready to love someone who needed so much healing. But Luke, that wasn't about me not being worthy of love. It was about them not being brave enough to give it." She reached out and gently brushed a tear from his cheek. "I am brave enough. And you are absolutely worthy of love, even when you're sad, even when you miss your daddy, even when you need things. Especially then." Luke leaned into her touch, and Elena found herself pulling him closer, wrapping her arms around his small frame as he burrowed against her shoulder. "Can I tell you a secret?" she whispered into his hair. He nodded against her chest. "I was scared too. Scared that I wouldn't know how to take care of you. Scared that I would mess this up somehow. But then I realized, we don't have to be perfect. We just have to be brave enough to try." They sat like that for a long time, Luke's breathing gradually evening out while Baxter kept watch over both of them. When Luke finally pulled back, his eyes were clearer. "Ms. Elena, are you going to be my maybe mom?" The question caught her off guard. "Your maybe mom? Like maybe forever?" Agent Hart said some kids get forever families and some kids just get temporary ones. "I know I can't have my daddy back, but maybe I could have you." Elena looked into his hopeful face and felt the last of her carefully constructed walls crumble. "Would you like that? Would you like me to be your maybe mom?" "I would like that very much," Luke said solemnly, "and I think Daddy would like it too. He always said I was his little star, and stars need a sky to live in. You could be my sky." The next morning, Elena found herself doing something she'd never imagined, sitting at her kitchen table with Luke eating cereal while researching family law attorneys on her laptop. "What are you looking at?" Luke asked, swinging his legs from his chair. "I'm looking into the process of becoming your legal guardian," Elena said, surprised by how natural the words felt. "It means making our family official, with papers and everything." Luke's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. "Really? Like really, really? Really, really, if that's what you want." Luke set down his spoon carefully and walked around the table to Elena's chair. He climbed onto her lap, something he'd never done before, and wrapped his arms around her neck. "I want that more than anything," he whispered. "Can we call Agent Hart and tell her?" By noon, Elena had spoken with 3 attorneys, scheduled a consultation for the following week, and begun the preliminary paperwork for guardianship. Rachel, who had arrived to find Elena surrounded by legal documents and Luke making a celebration banner out of construction paper, simply smiled and made coffee. "This is really happening," Rachel said, settling into the chair across from Elena. "This is really happening," Elena agreed, watching Luke carefully color in letters that spelled family in rainbow crayon. "Marco's handling the press strategy, and I've cleared my schedule for the next week to focus on the legal requirements." Her phone buzzed with a text from Agent Hart, "Heard through the grapevine that you're moving forward with guardianship. Can we schedule a final home evaluation? Also, fair warning, there's been some media interest in Luke's case. Nothing specific yet, but I wanted you to be prepared." Elena showed the message to Rachel, who frowned. "Media interest from where?" Before Elena could answer, her phone rang. Marco's name flashed on the screen. "Gray's been busy," Marco said without preamble. "He leaked the story to the Business Journal. Not the full story, just enough to raise questions about your judgment and fitness to lead. I'm working on damage control, but Elena, this is about to get very public." Elena looked at Luke, who was now showing Baxter his banner, completely unaware that his private story was about to become public entertainment. "How long do we have?" she asked. "The story goes live this afternoon. I've prepared a statement, but you'll need to decide how much you want to share. The narrative right now is about an unstable CEO making rash personal decisions that could impact shareholder value." Elena felt the familiar surge of protective fury. "They want to make this about business? Fine, we'll make it about business. Schedule a press conference for tomorrow morning." "And Marco?" "Yeah? Make sure every family advocacy group in the city knows about it. If Gray wants to turn this into a public debate about corporate responsibility and family values, let's give him exactly what he asked for." After she hung up, Luke looked up from his banner with curious eyes. "Is everything okay, Miss Elena?" Elena knelt down to his level, taking his small hands in hers. "Some people might start asking questions about our family, Luke. Reporters and newspaper people. They might want to take pictures or ask us to talk about how we met." Luke considered this seriously. "Will you tell them about how I found you in the office with the extra chair? If you want me to." "But, Luke, I need you to know, no matter what anyone says, no matter what's in the newspapers or on TV, it doesn't change anything between us. You're my family now, and I'm going to fight for that, okay?" Luke nodded, then carefully placed his banner on the kitchen table next to Elena's legal documents. The bright crayon letters stood out against the formal paperwork, a splash of childhood hope against the stark reality of adult bureaucracy. "Daddy always said that the best families are the ones that choose each other," Luke said, reaching for Elena's hand. "I choose you, Ms. Elena, forever and for real." Elena squeezed his small fingers, looking at the evidence of their emerging life scattered across her kitchen table. Legal papers next to finger-painted art, coffee cups next to juice boxes, the serious business of building a family happening in the spaces between breakfast and lunch. "I choose you too, Luke," she said quietly. "Forever and for real." Outside, the city hummed with its usual energy, unaware that in one apartment, 52 floors above the street, 2 people were quietly revolutionizing each other's worlds, one crayon drawing and legal document at a time. The Sterling Technologies boardroom had never felt smaller. Elena sat at the head of the table, her hands folded calmly in front of her, while the weight of 20 years of empire building hung in the balance. Around the table, board members shifted in their leather chairs, the tension so thick it seemed to muffle even the sound of breathing. Harold Grayston had called this emergency meeting for exactly what Elena had expected, a vote of no confidence. The Business Journal article had run that morning with the headline, "Sterling CEO's Personal Crisis Raises Corporate Governance Concerns." and Gray had wasted no time capitalizing on the negative attention. Luke sat in his usual corner, drawing quietly while Baxter dozed at his feet. Elena had insisted on bringing them both, despite Gray's obvious displeasure. If the board was going to vote on her fitness to lead, based on her personal choices, then they needed to see exactly what those choices looked like. "The motion before us is simple," Gray was saying, his voice carrying the weight of manufactured concern. "Sterling Technologies requires leadership that is focused, stable, and committed to shareholder value above personal interests. Recent events suggest that Elena may no longer be capable of providing that leadership." Board member Patricia Chen leaned forward. "Harold, I think we need to be very careful about the precedent we're setting here. Elena's personal life." "Personal life?" Gray interrupted smoothly. "Patricia, we're talking about a CEO who has taken in a strange child with no legal standing, no background checks, no consideration for the liability this creates for the company. We're talking about someone who brings that child to board meetings and press conferences, turning Sterling Technologies into a tabloid curiosity." Elena felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her voice level. "The child's name is Luke Bennett. His father died in a hit-and-run accident 2 weeks ago. He's 6 years old, and he needed help. I provided it." "And that's admirable," Gray said with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "But Elena, surely you can see how this appears to our investors. A single woman, no family experience, making impulsive decisions about child-rearing while running a billion-dollar company. The psychological implications alone." "The psychological implications of what?" The voice that cut through Gray's monologue was sharp, clear, and belonged to Rachel, who stood in the doorway with a folder in her hands and fire in her eyes. Elena blinked in surprise. Rachel never attended board meetings, never inserted herself into corporate politics. But here she was, walking into the room with the kind of quiet authority that made everyone sit up straighter. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Rachel said, not sounding sorry at all, "but I have something the board needs to hear." Gray's face darkened. "This is a closed session." "This is a character assassination," Rachel said flatly, taking a position near Elena's chair. "And before you vote to destroy a good woman's career based on assumptions and prejudice, you should hear from someone who has watched Elena transform into exactly the kind of leader this company needs." She opened her folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "This is a letter Luke wrote yesterday when he heard people were saying mean things about Elena on the news. He asked me to help him spell some of the bigger words." Rachel's voice gentled as she began to read. "Dear board people, my name is Luke Bennett, and I am 6 years old. I heard on TV that some people think Ms. Elena is not good at her job anymore because she takes care of me. But I think they don't understand what good really means. Before I met Ms. Elena, I didn't have anywhere to go. I was scared and sad, and I missed my daddy very much. But then I found her office with the extra chair, and she didn't send me away even though I was wet and dirty and probably smelled bad. Ms. Elena taught me that good people don't just help when it's easy, they help when it's hard too. She could have called the police or the shelter people, but instead she made me pancakes and bought me new clothes and let me bring Baxter home. She still works very hard at her job, I know because I see her reading big papers and talking on important phone calls. But now she also helps me with my homework and teaches me how to tie my shoes better and listens when I tell her stories about my daddy. I think that makes her better at her job, not worse. Because now she knows how to take care of people, not just companies. And companies are made of people, so that seems very important. If you fire Miss Elena, you would be making a big mistake. Not just because she's good at business things, but because she's good at people things too. And I think the world needs more people who are good at both. Also, if you fire her, Baxter will be very sad. He likes living with us, and he's too old to have to move again. Thank you for reading my letter. I hope you will keep Ms. Elena as your boss because she is the best person I know. Love, Luke Bennett, and Baxter too." The silence that followed was profound. Elena felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back, looking around the table at faces that had transformed from skeptical to thoughtful to, in some cases, ashamed. James Morrison was the first to speak. "Elena, I owe you an apology. I let Harold's concerns override my own judgment about your character and capabilities." "We all did," Chen added quietly. "Harold, I think you fundamentally misread this situation." Gray's composure was beginning to crack. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. Emotional manipulation, using a child to... Using a child? Elena's voice cut through his protests like a blade. Harold, that letter wasn't manipulation. It was honesty from someone who has experienced both abandonment and rescue. Luke knows what it means to be thrown away, and he knows what it means to be valued. The question is, which of those experiences do we want to represent Sterling Technologies? She stood, walking over to Luke's corner where he was putting the finishing touches on a drawing that showed the boardroom table surrounded by stick figures, all of them smiling. You want to talk about psychological implications? Let's talk about them. I spent 7 years in foster care because my mother decided I was too much trouble to keep. I learned to make myself small, quiet, undemanding, because I believed that was the only way someone might want me around. Elena's voice grew stronger as she continued. I built this company with those same principles. Be perfect, need nothing from anyone, never show weakness, never let anyone see you as human. And it worked. Sterling Technologies became successful because I was willing to sacrifice everything human about myself for efficiency and profit. She looked directly at Gray. But you know what I learned in the last 2 weeks? The version of me that built this company was only half alive. The version of me that can comfort a grieving child, that can make room for an elderly dog, that can admit when she doesn't know how to braid hair but is willing to learn. That version is stronger, not weaker. That version sees opportunities where the old me only saw liabilities. Marco, who had been quiet in the back of the room, stepped forward with his laptop. If I may, I'd like to share some data that supports Elena's point. Since the story about Luke broke, Sterling Technologies, stock has actually risen 3%. Our social media engagement is up 40%, and I fielded calls from 5 major clients who specifically want to work with us because of how this situation was handled. He clicked to a new slide. The narrative isn't about an unstable CEO making poor decisions. It's about a company led by someone with both business acumen and human compassion. In today's market, that's not a liability. It's a competitive advantage. Gray was looking increasingly isolated as heads around the table began to nod. This is all very touching, he said with barely concealed venom, but the fundamental question remains, can Elena Sterling lead this company with appropriate focus and judgment? I can answer that, said a new voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Agent Lila Hart standing in the entrance, her official credentials visible on her blazer. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I believe this board is discussing the guardianship situation that falls under my purview. Elena's heart stopped. Had something gone wrong with the legal proceedings? Was Agent Hart here to remove Luke? But Agent Hart's expression was calm, almost pleased. I wanted to inform the board that my final evaluation of Ms. Sterling's fitness as a guardian has been completed. In 15 years of social work, I have rarely seen a placement that has resulted in such positive outcomes for a child in crisis. She walked into the room with quiet authority. Luke Bennett has gone from a traumatized child showing signs of severe grief and attachment disorder to a thriving, confident little boy who feels safe enough to advocate for the person he loves. That transformation doesn't happen by accident. It happens when a child finds exactly the kind of stability and care he needs. Agent Hart looked directly at Gray. I understand there are concerns about Miss Sterling's judgment. Speaking as someone whose job it is to evaluate judgment when it comes to child welfare, I can tell you that her decisions regarding Luke have been exemplary. She has prioritized his well-being while maintaining her professional responsibilities. She has sought appropriate support and guidance. She has shown exactly the kind of balanced decision-making that effective leadership requires. The room was completely silent except for the soft scratch of Luke's crayon against paper. Morrison cleared his throat. Harold, I think we've heard enough. I call for an immediate vote on your motion of no confidence. Seconded, Chen said quickly. The vote was swift and decisive. 12 against Gray's motion, 3 abstentions, and only Gray himself voting in favor of Elena's removal. As board members began to file out, many stopping to thank Elena or to introduce themselves to Luke, Gray gathered his papers with barely contained fury. This isn't over, Elena, he said quietly as he passed her chair. You think you've won something here, but you've just shown everyone exactly how vulnerable you are. And vulnerable leaders don't last long in this business. After he left, Elena sank back into her chair, the adrenaline of the confrontation leaving her feeling simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated. Luke walked over and climbed onto her lap, something that had become natural over the past weeks. Did you win? He asked simply. Elena looked around the boardroom, her boardroom, still hers, still the center of the empire she'd built. But now it felt different, warmer somehow, like a space that had finally learned what it was really for. "We won," she said, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. "We won." Agent Lila Hart arrived at Elena's apartment at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, carrying a leather briefcase and the kind of professional calm that came from years of evaluating families in crisis. This was the final home study, the last hurdle before Elena's guardianship petition could move forward, and everyone in the apartment seemed to understand the weight of the moment. Luke had been up since dawn, carefully organizing his drawings and making sure Baxter's water bowl was full. He'd asked Elena 3 times if his room was quote, neat enough for company, and she'd assured him each time that it was perfect, even though perfect was no longer a word that described their life together. Elena's apartment had transformed over the past 3 weeks. The sterile perfection she'd once prized had given way to something messier but infinitely more alive. Luke's artwork was magneted to the refrigerator door. Baxter's toys were scattered across the living room floor. The spare bedroom that had once been an elegant guest suite now held a child-sized bed, a bookshelf full of picture books, and glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to the ceiling in constellations Luke had designed himself. "Good morning, Luke," Agent Hart said warmly as Elena let her in. "How are you settling in?" "Good," Luke replied with enthusiasm, then caught himself and added more solemnly, "Very well, thank you. Would you like to see my room? I organized everything the way Ms. Elena taught me." Agent Hart smiled. "I'd love to see your room, but first let's sit together and talk a little bit." They settled in the living room, Baxter immediately positioning himself at Luke's feet with the protective instincts he developed over the weeks. Agent Hart pulled out her notebook and began with the routine questions Elena had expected: Luke's adjustment to the new environment, his emotional state, any concerns or difficulties. But as the conversation continued, Agent Hart's questions became more observational, less clinical. She asked Luke about his favorite parts of living with Elena, about what they did together in the evenings, about whether he felt safe expressing his feelings when he was sad or angry. "Sometimes I still cry about Daddy," Luke said honestly, "but Ms. Elena doesn't get mad when I cry. She just sits with me until I feel better. And sometimes she tells me stories about when she was little and missed her mama." Elena felt her chest tighten at Luke's matter-of-fact description of their evening conversations. She hadn't realized he understood those moments as her sharing her own childhood grief alongside his. "What else do you do together?" Agent Hart asked. Luke's face lit up. "We cook." "Well, Miss Elena is learning to cook. Last week we made pancakes and only burned 2 of them. And we read books before bed. And Ms. Elena is teaching me how to tie my shoes the bunny ear way instead of the loop way." He paused, then added with the seriousness that characterized all his pronouncements, "And we take care of Baxter together. Ms. Elena says that when you love someone, you take care of their needs even when it's inconvenient." Agent Hart made a note, then looked at Elena. "And how has this transition been for you? What's been the most challenging part?" Elena considered the question carefully. "Learning to put someone else's needs first," she said finally. "Not just Luke's physical needs, food, clothing, shelter, but his emotional needs. Learning to recognize when he's tired versus when he's sad versus when he just needs attention. Learning that showing up consistently matters more than doing everything perfectly." "Can you give me an example?" Elena glanced at Luke, who was listening with the intensity he brought to all adult conversations. "Last week Luke had a nightmare about his father. It was 2 in the morning, and I had an important presentation the next day. The old me would have comforted him quickly and sent him back to bed so I could get the sleep I needed." She reached over and smoothed Luke's hair. "Instead, I made hot chocolate, and we sat on the couch for an hour while he told me about the dream and about things he missed about his dad. I was exhausted the next day, but Luke felt secure enough to talk about his feelings. That trade-off, my comfort for his emotional safety, it's become automatic now." Agent Hart nodded, making more notes. "Luke, can you show me your favorite spot in the apartment?" Luke immediately led them to the kitchen island, where 2 stools sat side by side. "This is where we eat breakfast, and where Ms. Elena helps me with reading practice, and where we do puzzles when it's raining outside." "What makes it special?" "Because it's where we talk," Luke said simply. "Ms. Elena always sits next to me, not across from me, so we're on the same side. Daddy used to do that too." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes. She hadn't consciously chosen to sit beside Luke rather than across from him, but she realized now that it had become their pattern. sitting together rather than facing off, presenting a united front to the world. Agent Hart spent the next hour observing their natural interactions. She watched Luke show Elena a drawing he'd made of their family, 3 figures and a dog under a house-shaped roof. She observed Elena helping Luke reach a book on a high shelf, then sitting with him to read it together. She noted the way Baxter moved between them like a furry ambassador, connecting them both to something larger than themselves. "Elena," Agent Hart said as they moved toward Luke's bedroom, "I have to ask about the practical considerations. You're a CEO of a major corporation. How do you balance those responsibilities with Luke's needs?" "I've restructured my schedule," Elena said without hesitation. "I work from home 2 days a week. I've hired additional support staff so I'm not staying late unnecessarily. And I've learned to delegate more effectively, something that's actually made the company run more efficiently." She paused at the doorway to Luke's room, where the afternoon sun was streaming through windows overlooking the city. "I used to think that being indispensable was the mark of good leadership. Now I understand that building systems and people who can function without constant oversight is much more valuable." In Luke's room, Agent Hart examined the careful balance of child-appropriate furniture and Elena's obvious efforts to create a space that felt permanent. There were photos of Luke with his father on the nightstand, artwork covering one wall, and books arranged at Luke's eye level. "This looks like a room that belongs to someone who plans to stay," Agent Hart observed. "Because I am staying," Luke said firmly. "This is my home now." "Ms. Elena said so." Agent Hart smiled. "And how do you feel about that, Luke?" "Happy," Luke said immediately. "And safe. And like maybe I don't have to worry anymore about people leaving." That evening, after Agent Hart had finished her evaluation and left with promises to complete her report within the week, Elena found herself sitting on Luke's bed for their nightly reading ritual. Tonight's book was about a little bird who got lost in a storm and found a new family with some field mice. "Ms. Elena?" Luke said as she reached the end of the story. "Agent Hart asked me if I was happy here." "What did you tell her?" Luke considered this with his usual seriousness. "I told her that before I lived with you, I was just sad all the time. Like, sad was the only feeling I had left, but now I have lots of feelings again. Happy when we make pancakes, proud when I read a whole page by myself, excited when Baxter learns a new trick." He snuggled closer to her side. "I told her that you didn't just give me a place to live, you gave me back all my feelings. Even the sad ones are better now because I don't have to carry them all by myself." Elena felt her throat close with emotion. "Agent Hart asked me something similar, about how this has changed me. What did you say?" Elena looked around the room, at the glow-in-the-dark stars Luke had arranged in the pattern his father had taught him, at the drawings that covered every available surface, at Baxter curled up in the corner with one eye open, watching over his boy. "I told her that I spent most of my life building walls," Elena said quietly. "Walls around my heart, walls around my time, walls around my space. I thought the walls were protecting me, but they were actually just keeping me alone." She pulled Luke closer. "You didn't tear down my walls, sweetheart. You showed me how to build doors instead. Doors I could open when I wanted to let love in, and close when we needed privacy, but never lock from the inside again." Luke yawned, his head heavy against her shoulder. "I'm glad you learned about doors, Ms. Elena. Walls are lonely." As Elena tucked him in and kissed his forehead goodnight, she thought about Agent Hart's final question. "Do you believe this placement is in Luke's best interest?" The answer had been immediate and absolute. "I believe Luke and I are each other's best interest now. We're better people together than we were apart." Elena turned off the light and headed toward her own room, but paused in the hallway. Through Luke's cracked door, she could hear him whispering to Baxter about the day's events, the soft murmur of a child who felt safe enough to process his thoughts out loud. For the first time in weeks, Elena wasn't worried about Agent Hart's report. Whatever it said, whatever recommendations it contained, the truth was undeniable. This was a family now, built not on perfect credentials or ideal circumstances, but on the radical decision to choose each other daily, to show up imperfectly but consistently, to love bravely despite the risks. In her bedroom, Elena looked out at the city lights and whispered a prayer to whatever forces had sent Luke to her office that stormy night. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for teaching me that the best things in life aren't planned or earned or deserved. They're chosen, and received, and held carefully until they become home." The family courthouse in Lower Manhattan was nothing like Elena had expected. Instead of the imposing marble and mahogany she associated with legal proceedings, the building felt almost cozy. Worn wooden benches, soft lighting, and walls covered with children's artwork that spoke to hope rather than judgment. Elena sat in the front row beside her attorney, David Chen, Patricia's nephew, recommended specifically for his expertise in family law, while Luke fidgeted with nervous energy next to her. He wore his best outfit, the navy blazer Rachel had helped him pick out, paired with jeans and sneakers because Elena had insisted he should feel like himself, not like someone playing dress-up. Baxter lay at their feet, his status as emotional support animal officially recognized by the court after Agent Hart had submitted a letter explaining his role in Luke's adjustment and healing. The old dog seemed to sense the importance of the occasion. He remained unusually still, though his eyes tracked every movement in the room. All rise for the Honorable Judge Margaret Santos. Judge Santos was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a practical bun. She moved through the courtroom with the easy confidence of someone who had presided over hundreds of family cases and understood that her decisions shaped lives in ways that extended far beyond legal paperwork. Please be seated. We're here today for the guardianship petition of Elena Sterling regarding Luke Bennett. Judge Santos's voice was warm but businesslike. Ms. Sterling, I've reviewed the extensive documentation submitted in support of your petition. I'd like to begin by asking Luke a few questions, if that's acceptable to you. Elena nodded, her throat suddenly dry. She'd prepared for this moment for weeks, but now that it was here, she felt the familiar surge of perfectionist anxiety. What if she'd missed something crucial? What if Judge Santos saw some fatal flaw in their unconventional family structure? Luke, meanwhile, had straightened in his chair with the seriousness he brought to all important conversations. "Yes, ma'am, I'm ready." Judge Santos smiled. "Luke, do you understand why we're here today?" "Yes. Ms. Elena wants to be my legal guardian, which means she'll be responsible for me and make decisions about my life and take care of me until I'm grown up." Luke paused, then added, "And it means I get to stay with her forever, even if other people think our family is weird." A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the courtroom. Judge Santos's smile widened. "And how do you feel about that?" "Happy," Luke said immediately. "And safe. And like I belong somewhere again." "Can you tell me about living with Miss Sterling? What's it like?" Luke's face lit up. "Well, she's learning how to cook, so sometimes breakfast is a little crunchy. And she works really hard, but she always has time to help me with homework or listen when I want to talk about my daddy." His voice grew more confident as he continued. "She bought me a desk for drawing, and she puts my pictures on the refrigerator, and when I have bad dreams, she sits with me until I feel better. And she learned how to braid hair by watching YouTube because I wanted to know what that felt like." Elena touched her hand to the small braid Rachel had woven into Luke's hair that morning, his first time trying the style he'd been curious about since meeting a girl at the building's playground. "She gave me and Baxter a home when we didn't have anywhere else to go," Luke continued. "But more than that, she gave us a family, like the choosing each other kind, not just the living in the same place kind." Judge Santos nodded thoughtfully. "Luke, I need to ask you something important. If I approve this guardianship, it means Miss Sterling will have the legal authority to make decisions about your schooling, your medical care, where you live. Are you comfortable with that level of responsibility being in her hands?" Luke didn't hesitate. "Yes, ma'am." Ms. Elena already does all those things, but now she worries that someone might try to take me away from her. "If you make it legal, then she won't have to worry anymore, and neither will I." He glanced at Elena, then back at Judge Santos. "Also, she promised that even though she'll be in charge of the big decisions, she'll always ask me how I feel about things and include me in choices that affect me. She said families work best when everyone's voice matters." Judge Santos made a note, then looked at Elena. "Miss Sterling, I've read Agent Hart's evaluation, which is overwhelmingly positive. I've also reviewed the character references from your colleagues, your building staff, and Luke's temporary school placement. The picture that emerges is of someone who has made significant life adjustments to accommodate a child's needs while maintaining professional effectiveness." Elena nodded, not trusting her voice. "However," Judge Santos continued, "I want to address the elephant in the room. You're a single woman with no prior parenting experience. Taking on the guardianship of a child who has experienced significant trauma, What assurances can you give this court that you're prepared for the long-term challenges this arrangement may present? Elena had rehearsed this answer, but sitting in the courtroom with Luke beside her and their future hanging in the balance, she found herself abandoning her prepared remarks. Your Honor, you're right that I have no formal parenting experience. But I do have experience being a child who needed someone to choose her consistently, and I understand the cost of not having that person. She glanced at Luke, who was listening with rapt attention. I can't promise I'll never make mistakes. I've already made plenty. Burned pancakes, bought the wrong size shoes, initially tried to parent through spreadsheets and schedules instead of intuition and flexibility. A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. But I can promise that I will never stop choosing Luke, never stop prioritizing his well-being, never stop learning how to be the parent he deserves. I've restructured my entire life around that commitment, and I would do it again without hesitation. Elena's voice grew stronger. Luke didn't just find a guardian that night in my office. I found my purpose. Being his mom isn't just what I do now, it's who I am. And I intend to spend the rest of my life living up to that title. Judge Santos nodded slowly, then looked back at Luke. Luke, I have one final question for you. Miss Sterling just called herself your mom. How does that make you feel? Luke's entire face transformed with joy. Like, maybe I get to have two dads and a mom. My daddy, who's watching from the stars, and Ms. Elena, who takes care of me here. And like maybe having people leave doesn't always mean they're gone forever. He paused, then added with devastating honesty. She already is my mom, Judge Santos. We just need the paper to say it too. The courtroom was completely silent for a moment. Elena felt tears streaming down her face, not from sadness but from the overwhelming rightness of Luke's words. Judge Santos smiled, her own eyes bright with emotion. Well then, let's make it official. She lifted her gavel. Guardianship petition granted. Luke Bennett, meet your legal guardian. Ms. Sterling, meet your son. The gavel came down with a soft thud that echoed through Elena's chest like a heartbeat. Luke launched himself from his chair into Elena's arms, wrapping his small body around her with the ferocity of someone who had finally stopped worrying about being sent away. Elena held him tight, breathing in the scent of his hair and feeling the last piece of her carefully guarded heart click into place. We did it, Luke whispered against her neck. We're really family now. We were always family, Elena whispered back. Now everyone else knows it too. As they gathered their paperwork and prepared to leave the courthouse, Luke tugged on Elena's sleeve. Mom, he said, testing out the word with obvious delight. Can we go home now? I want to call Rachel and Marco and tell them we won. Elena, mom now, legally and forever, took her son's hand and headed toward the door, toward home, toward the rest of their life together. Yes, sweetheart, she said, the word mom settling into her heart like it had been waiting there all along. Let's go home. 6 months later, Elena Sterling sat in her office on the 52nd floor, watching the late afternoon sun paint golden rectangles across the marble floor. The space looked almost exactly as it had that stormy night when Luke had first appeared in her doorway. Same windows, same desk, same view of Manhattan stretching endlessly below. But everything had changed. Across from her mahogany desk, where there had once been a single guest chair, now sat two. The second chair was smaller, upholstered in soft gray fabric, with a little step stool tucked underneath and a basket beside it filled with colored pencils, sketch pads, and the kind of educational puzzles Luke favored during his after-school visits to the office. Luke himself was currently sprawled on the Persian rug, tongue poking out in concentration as he worked on what appeared to be an architectural drawing of their apartment building, complete with tiny windows and a detailed rendering of Baxter sleeping in the lobby. At 8 years old now, they'd celebrated his birthday with a party that included half the building's staff and what felt like every child in Manhattan. Luke had grown into his role as Elena's son with the same quiet confidence he brought to everything else. Mom, he said without looking up from his drawing, the word still sending a warm flutter through Elena's chest every time she heard it. What's the difference between revenue and profit again? Elena smiled. Luke had been sitting in on her less sensitive meetings for months now, absorbing business concepts with the same serious attention he brought to his multiplication tables. Revenue is all the money that comes in, she explained, and profit is what's left after you pay for everything you need to run the business. Like how my allowance is revenue, but my profit is what's left after I buy Baxter's treats? Exactly like that. Luke nodded sagely and returned to his drawing, adding what looked like a small dog figure to the lobby area. Elena watched him work, marveling as always at the way he'd seamlessly woven himself into the fabric of her professional life. The Sterling Technologies staff had embraced him completely. Rachel had become his unofficial second mother. Marco regaled him with stories about his own daughters, and even the security guards had taken to saving him the good stickers from their shift reports. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, and Agent Lila Hart stepped into the office, carrying a folder and wearing the kind of smile that suggested good news. "Ms. Sterling, Elena," Agent Hart corrected herself with a grin. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Agent Hart!" Luke scrambled to his feet, abandoning his drawing to rush over for a hug. In the months since the adoption had been finalized, Agent Hart had become something like a fairy godmother to their family, checking in regularly not out of professional obligation but out of genuine affection. "Hello, Luke. How's school going?" "Really good. I'm in advanced reading now, and I'm teaching some of the younger kids how to draw buildings. Mom says I might be an architect when I grow up, or maybe a CEO like her, or maybe both." Elena felt the familiar surge of pride and amazement at Luke's confidence. The frightened, grieving boy who'd appeared in her office had blossomed into a child who believed he could be anything, do anything, dream as big as the city skyline outside their windows. "I'm here for my 6-month follow-up," Agent Hart explained to Elena, "but honestly, it's more of a formality at this point. Luke is thriving, you're both clearly happy, and I've never seen a more successful placement." She paused, then added with obvious emotion, "Elena, I've been doing this job for 16 years. I've seen a lot of families. Biological, adoptive, foster, chosen. What you and Luke have built together, it's special. It's exactly what every child in the system hopes for, but so few ever find." Elena felt her throat tighten. "He saved me as much as I saved him." "I know. That's what makes it work." Agent Hart pulled a document from her folder. "I wanted to deliver this in person. It's the final closure on Luke's case file. As of today, he's officially, permanently, irrevocably yours. No more check-ins, no more evaluations, no more bureaucracy. You're just a family now." Luke whooped with joy and threw his arms around Elena's waist. "Does this mean no one can ever take me away from you?" "No one," Elena confirmed, hugging him tight. "We're stuck with each other forever." "Good," Luke said firmly. "I like being stuck with you." After Agent Hart left, Elena and Luke settled into their evening routine. Luke finished his homework at the small desk Rachel had installed in the corner, while Elena reviewed reports and answered emails. Baxter, now a permanent office resident with his own bed beside Luke's chair, dozed contentedly in the patch of late sunlight by the windows. As the sun began to set, painting the office in shades of gold and amber, Elena found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. The scared, control-obsessed woman who'd once occupied this space seemed like a different person now, someone she barely recognized. "Mom?" Luke's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Can I show you something?" He walked over to her desk carrying a large sheet of paper, his expression unusually serious. "I've been working on this for weeks, and I wanted to wait until it was perfect." Elena took the drawing, and her breath caught. It showed their family, Elena, Luke, and Baxter, but they weren't alone. The paper was filled with other figures. Rachel with her warm smile, Marco with his kind eyes, Agent Hart with her official badge, even James the security guard with his friendly wave. In the center of the drawing was the Sterling Technologies building, but Luke had added something that wasn't really there, a giant heart encompassing the entire structure. "It's everyone who helped make our family," Luke explained. "I know it's just me and you and Baxter who live together, but all these other people are part of us too, right? Like, they're the ones who made it possible for us to find each other." Elena studied the drawing, seeing their story reflected in Luke's careful artwork. "You're absolutely right. Families aren't just the people who live in the same house. They're all the people who choose to love and support each other." "Exactly." Luke beamed. "And look." He pointed to a section of the drawing Elena had missed. In the corner, barely visible among all the other figures, was a man with Luke's eyes and gentle smile, surrounded by stars. "Daddy's still part of our family too. He's just in the sky part instead of the earth part." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes. "Luke, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Can we hang it in the office? Right where everyone can see it when they come to visit?" "I think that's perfect." As Elena carefully pinned Luke's drawing to the wall behind her desk, she thought about the Sterling Futures program they'd launched 3 months ago. Already, they'd placed 12 young people from foster care into internship programs throughout the company. 2 had received full college scholarships. 1 had been promoted to a permanent position in the marketing department. It had started with Luke's simple observation about extra chairs, about making room for people who needed it. Now it was becoming something bigger, a systematic approach to changing lives, one young person at a time. "Mom," Luke said, settling into his chair with a fresh sheet of paper, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that, sweetheart?" "Remember that first night, when I asked if I could stay with you?" Elena nodded, remembering the way her heart had cracked open at his quiet plea. "I was so scared you'd say no, but you didn't. You made room for me even though you didn't have to." Luke started sketching as he talked, his hands moving with the unconscious confidence of someone lost in creative flow. "I think that's what love really is. Making room for someone even when it's hard or scary or you don't know how it's going to work out." Elena watched her son, legally and completely and forever, bent over his drawing, and felt the profound contentment that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged. "You know what I think," she said, walking over to sit in the chair beside his. "I think you're going to grow up to be very wise." Luke grinned up at her. "I learned from the best." Outside the windows, Manhattan glittered with a million points of light, each one representing someone's home, someone's family, someone's version of love. And here, 52 floors above the bustling streets, in an office that had once echoed with loneliness, a mother and son sat side by side in their extra chairs, drawing pictures of the life they'd built together, one careful, courageous choice at a time. The office with the extra chair had become exactly what Luke had always known it could be, a place where everyone belonged, where love was bigger than fear, where the most important business conducted wasn't about profit margins or quarterly reports, but about the quiet revolution of making room for each other in a world that so often forgot to leave space for love. Elena Sterling looked at her son, her heart, her greatest accomplishment, and whispered the words that had become their family motto, "There's always room for one more chair at our table." Luke smiled and continued drawing, adding another figure to his ever-expanding portrait of their chosen family, secure in the knowledge that home wasn't a place. It was the people who chose to love you, even when you came barefoot in the rain, asking for just one night that turned into forever. The end. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.